It was supposed to be the textbook demonstration of American military superiority. June 1968. A United States Army colonel stood at the edge of a jungle clearing outside Nha Trang, arms crossed, stopwatch in hand, watching a 5-man Australian SAS patrol prepare what he called, with barely concealed contempt, a third-world ambush. He had spent 15 minutes lecturing a group of long-range reconnaissance patrol students on the proper American doctrine: fire superiority, massed response, full platoon commitment, 20 men minimum, artillery on call, helicopter gunships overhead, 20 minutes sustained engagement to ensure enemy destruction. The Australians nodded politely, asked no questions, and walked into the tree line. The colonel turned to his students. "Watch this circus," he said. "They'll take an hour to set up, and half their kills will walk away wounded." 30 seconds. That's how long the engagement lasted when a simulated enemy element walked down that trail. 30 seconds from the first Claymore detonation to the last shot fired to the Australians vanishing back into the jungle as if they had never existed. The colonel stopped his stopwatch, looked at it, looked at the Australian patrol leader who was already lighting a cigarette, and said nothing. There was nothing to say, because what that colonel had just watched was not an ambush the way the American Army understood ambushes. It was something else entirely, something that would be studied, dissected, and eventually partially adopted by every American Special Operations unit that came after, something the Viet Cong had learned to fear more than B-52 strikes, something that would force the Pentagon to rewrite its doctrine on small unit engagement and rewrite what American soldiers believed was possible when 5 men in a jungle decided that 30 seconds was all the time they needed. You're about to discover how one ambush technique, refined in the jungles of Phuoc Tuy province by men who had been mocked as primitives by their American allies, became the template for modern Western special operations. And trust me, by the end of this, you'll understand why American instructors at the MACV Recondo School in Nha Trang kept an Australian warrant officer on permanent staff throughout the entire life of the school. It wasn't diplomacy, it was necessity. Stay with me. To understand what made the 30-second ambush possible, you have to first understand what American doctrine considered an ambush to be in 1968. In the standard United States Army Field Manual of the period, an ambush was a deliberate attack from a concealed position on a moving or temporarily halted enemy force. The textbook approach involved a minimum of a reinforced platoon, somewhere between 30 and 40 men. It demanded 3 distinct elements: an assault element to occupy the killing ground, a support element with machine guns providing fire superiority, a security element covering the flanks and rear against enemy reinforcement. The engagement itself was expected to last between 15 and 30 minutes, sometimes longer, with heavy artillery support called in after the initial contact to finish the job. The underlying philosophy was simple: overwhelming firepower creates overwhelming results. More men, more bullets, more explosions, more success. This doctrine had been refined through 2 world wars and Korea. It was considered, in American military culture, the correct way to destroy an enemy force on the move. The Australians looked at this doctrine and identified a fundamental problem. It did not work in the Vietnamese jungle. The reasons were physical before they were tactical. Jungle visibility in Phuoc Tuy province averaged between 3 and 15 meters, depending on canopy density. A 30-man ambush element spread across a killing zone big enough to catch a Viet Cong platoon simply could not see each other, let alone coordinate fire. Communication required voice or hand signals, and voice meant noise, and noise meant detection before the enemy ever reached the killing ground. Artillery support called in during engagement took a minimum of 4 to 6 minutes to arrive at the target coordinates, and by that time the enemy had either escaped into the undergrowth or closed the distance to a range where friendly artillery would kill the ambushers as readily as the ambushed. The Viet Cong had studied this American pattern for years. They developed a counter-tactic called hugging the belt, moving so close to American positions during contact that heavy weapons support became too dangerous to use. Australian doctrine emerged from a completely different evolutionary path. The lineage ran through the Malayan Emergency of 1948 to 1960, where Commonwealth forces had fought communist insurgents in jungle terrain almost identical to Vietnam. It ran through Borneo during the Indonesian confrontation of 1963 to 1966, where the Australian SAS had conducted secret cross-border patrols against Indonesian regulars. By the time Australian SAS squadrons began deploying to Vietnam in June 1966, the regiment had 20 years of accumulated lessons about what actually worked in triple canopy jungle. The core insight was counterintuitive to anyone trained in conventional warfare. In the jungle, the smaller the unit, the more effective the ambush. A 5-man patrol could move silently in ways a 30-man platoon never could. A 5-man patrol could remain undetected in a concealed position for days in ways a larger formation could not. Most critically, a 5-man patrol could initiate and complete an engagement in a time frame so compressed that the enemy never had the chance to coordinate a response. The Australians did not want to fight the enemy for 20 minutes. They wanted to destroy the enemy in 20 seconds, and they wanted to be gone before the bodies hit the ground. This was the philosophical foundation of what would become the 30-second ambush. It was not about prolonged engagement. It was about catastrophic, instantaneous violence delivered with surgical precision, followed by immediate disappearance. The mechanics of the 30-second ambush began with site selection, and this was where Australian tracking methodology proved decisive. SAS patrols inserted into an operational area typically spent the first 3 to 5 days doing nothing but observing enemy movement patterns. They identified what the Australians called tracks, the habitual paths used by Viet Cong couriers, supply parties, and security patrols moving between bunker complexes and cache sites. These were heavily used routes worn by months or years of foot traffic, usually along contour lines that offered the easiest movement through difficult terrain. A good track showed subtle but unmistakable signs to a trained observer. Compressed vegetation along the center line, small broken branches at chest and shoulder height, distinctive scuff marks where sandaled feet had passed. Once a high-value track was identified, the patrol leader selected an ambush site based on 3 criteria. The site had to offer concealment for 5 men within 15 meters of the kill zone. The site had to have a clear withdrawal route that could be traversed in near silence. And the site had to be positioned at a natural terrain feature, usually a bend in the trail, that forced enemy forces to bunch together briefly as they navigated the obstacle. This bunching was critical. It meant that when the ambush initiated, the enemy formation would be compressed into a killing ground no more than 8 meters long, ensuring that every claymore and every automatic weapon would find multiple targets simultaneously. A site meeting all three criteria might take 2 or 3 days of patient reconnaissance to locate. The Australians would not settle for a merely adequate position. They waited until the terrain itself became a weapon. The weapons layout for a 30-second ambush was a masterpiece of small unit fire planning compressed into a 15-meter frontage. At the center of the patrol line, the patrol leader or signaler operated the initiating Claymore bank, typically 2 or 3 M18A1 Claymore mines, wired in series to a single clacker detonator. Each Claymore projected 700 steel ball bearings in a 60-degree arc at lethal velocity out to 50 meters. When banked together and detonated simultaneously, the Claymore barrage delivered more than 2,000 projectiles into the kill zone in a single millisecond. The Australian Army Research Centre's analysis of 1st Australian Task Force combat data revealed that Claymore-initiated ambushes produced 1 enemy casualty for every 2.9 detonations, a lethality ratio that exceeded every other weapon system used by Australian forces in Vietnam. Flanking the patrol leader were typically 2 riflemen with modified L1A1 self-loading rifles, the Australian variant of the Belgian FNFAL. The modification was illegal by the letter of Australian Army regulation, but winked at by every officer who actually operated in the jungle. The unit armorer would cut the barrel down from 21 inches to approximately 17 inches, weld on a custom flash suppressor, and sometimes attach a vertical foregrip carved from hardwood. The resulting weapon, unofficially called the bitch by the troopers who carried it, sacrificed long-range accuracy for maneuverability in dense jungle and produced a muzzle flash and report so aggressive that it simulated the firepower of a much larger force. On the flanks of the ambush line, the patrol typically deployed a soldier carrying an M16 Armalite, the American rifle that Australian SAS analysis showed accounted for roughly 2/3 of confirmed SAS kills in Vietnam, despite the SLR being the official service weapon. The M16's lighter weight and higher rate of fire made it ideal for the rapid suppression role the flanking positions required. Rounding out the patrol was usually a machine gunner with an M60, providing the sustained automatic fire that could tear through secondary enemy elements attempting to reinforce or counterattack. The initiation sequence was where decades of Australian training came together in what looked to American observers like choreographed violence. The patrol would typically establish positions at dusk, the evening before an anticipated enemy movement, or during the early morning hours while the jungle was still wet with dew and natural sounds masked the final approach to concealment. Each man dug himself into vegetation until he was essentially invisible from 1 meter away. Firing positions were constructed so that each soldier's field of fire overlapped with his neighbor's, creating a continuous wall of lethality across the entire kill zone. Once in position, the patrol entered what SAS veterans described as the waiting state, a psychological discipline that required soldiers to remain motionless and silent for periods that sometimes extended beyond 24 hours. Then the enemy arrived. The trigger point for initiation was almost always visual confirmation by the patrol leader that the lead element of the enemy formation had passed a pre-marked reference point, usually a specific tree or rock at the far end of the kill zone. At that moment, the leader detonated the Claymore bank. The first second of the engagement was apocalyptic. 2,000 steel ball bearings swept the kill zone horizontally at chest height. In that single millisecond, typically 3 to 5 enemy soldiers were killed outright, With the remainder thrown into shock and confusion by the sudden blast, the Australian soldiers, already braced against the blast wave, opened fire with every weapon simultaneously in a technique called maximum rate. Every rifle, every machine gun, every grenade launcher emptied into the kill zone as fast as the weapon could cycle. For the next 15 to 20 seconds, the ambush position poured approximately 2,000 rounds of small arms fire into a space no larger than a suburban living room. Captain A.W. Fremantle, an Australian officer who documented SAS contact procedures in after-action reports later published by the Australian Army Research Centre, noted that this overwhelming volume of fire served multiple purposes beyond simply killing enemy soldiers. It created the impression among any surviving enemy that they had encountered a force far larger than 5 men. It broke the psychological paralysis that can momentarily freeze soldiers at the initiation of contact, and it kept enemy heads down long enough to permit the ambush element to manage the tempo of the engagement. At approximately the 20-second mark, the patrol leader shouted the command that every SAS soldier had drilled into muscle memory during training: back break. It was the signal to reverse through the killing ground, firing the last rounds in each magazine in a final sweep across any visible movement, then turning and moving at speed through the pre-planned withdrawal route. The entire patrol had to be moving away from the ambush site within 30 seconds of the initial Claymore detonation. This was not a suggestion. It was doctrine, enforced by the hard mathematics of enemy response time. The Viet Cong had developed reaction drills for ambush contact that typically resulted in counterattack forces converging on the ambush location within 90 seconds to 2 minutes. An Australian patrol that remained at the site for longer than 30 seconds risked being caught in its own killing ground by enemy reinforcements. An Australian patrol that had extracted by the 30-second mark was usually 200 meters away before the enemy counterattack arrived, finding nothing but bodies, spent shell casings, and the distinctive rubber sandal prints that looked exactly like Viet Cong footgear. The withdrawal itself was as precisely choreographed as the engagement. Each soldier knew his position in the movement order. The last man out, typically the machine gunner, laid down a final burst into the kill zone, then rotated through predetermined cover positions as the patrol bounded backwards through the jungle. Within 5 minutes, the patrol had typically moved 400 meters and established a hasty rally point. Within 20 minutes, they were preparing for helicopter extraction from a landing zone that might be a full kilometer from the contact site. By the time Viet Cong counter-tracking teams could pick up the trail, the Australians were already airborne. This was the engagement the Viet Cong High Command came to fear more than any other form of Allied contact. Captured North Vietnamese Army documents from 1969 and 1970, now available through the Australian War Memorial Archives, revealed that Communist forces had developed entirely separate operational guidance for areas where Australian SAS patrols were known to operate. American engagements, the documents suggested, were manageable because they were predictable. The Americans arrived loudly, fought in doctrinally recognizable patterns, and followed consistent extraction procedures. The Australian SAS could not be managed through pattern recognition. Their patrols were, quite literally, invisible until the moment of engagement, at which point the engagement was already over. The phrase that appeared repeatedly in captured communist documents, translated into English for intelligence summaries, described Australian SAS as Ma Rung, which Vietnamese speakers rendered variously as phantoms of the jungle, jungle ghosts, or forest spirits. The connotation carried religious weight in Vietnamese culture, implying something not entirely of this world. This was not merely operational respect. It was existential dread, the kind of dread that degraded combat effectiveness in ways no amount of training could fully counteract. Communist commanders reported increasing difficulty maintaining unit cohesion in areas where Australian patrols were suspected of operating. Couriers refused assignments along known Australian hunting grounds. Political officers noted deterioration in morale among troops assigned to Phuoc Tuy province compared to troops operating against American forces in adjacent sectors. The statistics that emerged from the 6-year Australian SAS deployment to Vietnam validated the 30-second ambush doctrine with mathematical precision. According to the Special Air Service Regiment's official history, Australian and New Zealand SAS patrols conducted nearly 1,200 patrols during the war, inflicting at least 492 confirmed enemy killed, with an additional 106 possibly killed, 47 wounded, 10 possibly wounded, and 11 prisoners captured. Against this, SASR losses totaled 1 man killed in action, 1 died of wounds, 3 accidentally killed, 1 missing, and 1 death from illness, with 28 additional men wounded. The 580 SAS personnel who served in Vietnam during the period produced a kill-to-loss ratio that, depending on how one counted, fell somewhere between 50 to 1 and 500 to 1. By any measurement, it was the most favorable kill ratio of any Australian unit to serve in the war. Yet raw statistics understated the strategic significance of what the SAS was accomplishing. Every confirmed kill from a 30-second ambush represented the removal of a specific individual from the Viet Cong war machine, usually a courier, supply runner, or small unit leader whose replacement required weeks of training. More importantly, every successful ambush created psychological damage that propagated through enemy units in ways that could not be measured in body counts. Enemy soldiers who survived Australian ambushes returned to their bases with accounts of contacts that had begun and ended before anyone could identify where the fire was coming from. These accounts metastasized through enemy units, generating the operational paralysis that made Phuoc Tuy province, over time, into increasingly hostile ground for Communist forces. The Americans could not ignore these results, though many American senior officers clearly wanted to. By early 1967, as American LRRP units struggled to achieve comparable results using American doctrine, pressure began to build within the Military Assistance Command Vietnam structure to incorporate Australian methods into American training. The result was the MACV Recondo School at Nha Trang, established on the 15th of September 1966 by direction of General William Westmoreland. The school was officially commanded by the 5th Special Forces Group and drew its primary instructor cadre from American Special Forces units, particularly those with experience in Project Delta. But from the school's earliest days until its final class in December 1970, the cadre roster included permanent Australian liaison personnel. According to Tom Halliwell's documented history of the school, the liaison personnel attached to MACV Recondo consisted of 1 Australian warrant officer who assisted the Australian training team in Vietnam and the SAS with Recondo training and occasionally led American teams on patrols, along with 3 South Korean Special Forces personnel. The presence of a permanent Australian warrant officer at an American training school was not casual diplomacy. It reflected an institutional recognition that the Australians possessed knowledge the Americans needed and could not replicate through purely internal development. During the school's operational life, it admitted 5,395 men and graduated 3,357 recondos, a failure rate of approximately 37%. The curriculum taught a compressed version of long-range patrol doctrine that drew heavily on Australian SAS techniques. 3-week course structure, 260 hours of classroom and field instruction. The graduation exercise, officially called You Bet Your Life, sent student teams on actual combat reconnaissance patrols in the Dongbo Mountains near Nha Trang. At least 2 students died during graduation patrols before the school closed. The curriculum included significant adaptation of Australian patrol techniques, 5-man patrol composition rather than American 10-man LRRP teams, slower movement rates with emphasis on extended periods of stationary observation, Claymore-initiated ambush procedures modeled on SAS contact drill, immediate action drills for breaking contact and withdrawing through pre-planned extraction routes. The adoption was not clean or complete. American institutional culture resisted full integration of Australian methods for reasons that had nothing to do with tactical effectiveness. American military doctrine in the 1960s valued aggression as a virtue, measured success through body count metrics that rewarded large-scale engagements, and maintained officer promotion structures that incentivized commanders to demonstrate initiative through visible operations rather than through the patient, almost invisible work that Australian methods demanded. American LRRP units often adopted the tactical elements of Australian ambush doctrine without adopting the underlying philosophical framework that made those elements work. A 5-man American patrol using Australian-style Claymore ambush techniques would still be ordered by higher headquarters to maintain constant radio contact, to report enemy sightings immediately rather than developing them into ambush opportunities, and to extract after 3 to 7 days in the field rather than the 2 to 3 weeks that Australian patrols routinely sustained. The result was partial adoption, producing partial results. American LRRP effectiveness improved measurably during 1967 and 1968. Kill ratios shifted in American favor. Patrol survivability increased. But American units never achieved the catastrophic force multiplier effect that Australian SAS produced from comparable numbers of operators. The gap was not about equipment, training hours, or individual soldier quality. The gap was about institutional willingness to allow small teams of professionals to operate with the level of autonomous judgment that the 30-second ambush doctrine required. As one former Viet Cong leader later acknowledged, American style was to hit the enemy and then call for planes and artillery, which allowed communist forces to break contact and disappear, while the Australians were more patient, better at guerrilla fighting, and better at ambushes. Beyond the tactical level, the 30-second ambush doctrine forced a series of uncomfortable realizations within American military, thinking that would reverberate long after the Vietnam War ended. The first realization concerned unit size. American doctrine had assumed since the Second World War that larger formations produced more decisive results than smaller ones. The mathematics of massed firepower seemed irrefutable. Australian results in Vietnam challenged this assumption at every level. A 5-man SAS patrol, properly trained and properly deployed, could achieve tactical effects in jungle terrain that an American infantry company could not replicate. This was not because the 5 Australians were individually better soldiers than the 150 Americans, though they were unquestionably more specialized. It was because the 5 Australians could do things the 150 Americans could not do, specifically remain invisible for extended periods in enemy-controlled territory. The second realization concerned the relationship between violence and time. American doctrine had assumed that prolonged engagement produced better results than brief engagement, because prolonged engagement allowed for the full application of supporting firepower. The 30-second ambush proved that under the right conditions, 30 seconds of properly directed violence could produce more lasting effects than 30 minutes of supported firefight. The key variable was not duration but precision, and precision required the kind of concentrated, small unit discipline that large formations structurally could not achieve. The third realization, and perhaps the most uncomfortable for American senior leadership, concerned the relationship between doctrine and culture. American military doctrine could be taught, and had been taught successfully, to Allied forces for decades. But the underlying culture that made Australian ambush techniques work, a culture of patience, individual initiative, and skeptical professionalism that mocked institutional pretension, could not simply be transplanted. It had to be cultivated over generations through the kind of hard-earned trial and error that the Australian military had experienced in Malaya, Borneo, and finally Vietnam. These realizations, painful as they were during the Vietnam period, eventually produced concrete changes in how American Special Operations Forces were organized, trained, and deployed. The post-Vietnam reform of American military doctrine during the 1970s and 1980s incorporated a number of concepts that had direct lineage from Australian SAS experience in Vietnam. The concept of operational tempo, the idea that rapidly executed decisions produced compounding advantages over slower reacting adversaries, mapped directly onto the 30-second ambush timeline. The concept of mission command, the delegation of tactical authority to the lowest competent level, mirrored the independent operational style that Australian SAS patrol leaders exercised throughout their Vietnam tours. The renewed emphasis on special operations capability during the Reagan administration, leading to the establishment of United States Special Operations Command in 1987, drew on lessons from both American Special Operations experience and Allied capabilities. Within specific American units, Australian influence was more direct and more traceable. Delta Force, officially designated the 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta when it was established in 1977, drew its organizational structure and selection methodology explicitly from the British SAS, which had been the parent organization for Australian SAS doctrine. The Navy SEAL community, expanded and refined after Vietnam, incorporated small unit reconnaissance and direct action techniques that had been pioneered by Australian SAS in Phua Tui Province. The 75th Ranger Regiment, reorganized in 1974, adopted small team tactical concepts that owed substantial intellectual debt to Australian and British SAS practice. None of these units would have credited their Australian predecessors publicly during the 1970s and 1980s. American institutional pride made such public acknowledgement diplomatically awkward, but the lineage was traceable through training curriculum, through exchange officer programs, and through the quiet transmission of tactical doctrine across the English-speaking Special Operations community. The individual Australian soldiers who pioneered this doctrine paid prices that statistical analysis could not capture. Private David Fisher, a national serviceman with 3 Squadron SAS, became the final SAS soldier declared missing in action during the war when his 5-man patrol was extracted from a hot landing zone near the Nui Mai Tau Massif on the 27th of September, 1969. Fisher was second in command of the patrol, which had been searching for signs of enemy activity in southeastern Long Con province when they had a series of sharp contacts with strong Viet Cong groups. Outnumbered and pursued through the jungle, they called for helicopter extraction, which arrived within half an hour just as the enemy were closing in. During the hectic moments of the hot extraction, while under fire and surrounded, the patrol members clipped their carabiners to ropes dangling from a helicopter and were lifted clear of the jungle. Fisher fell during the extraction. An air search began within 10 minutes of the incident, followed by a ground search 5 hours later. Fisher's body was not recovered at that time. He had only 2 months remaining on his tour of duty. His remains were finally located in August 2008, 39 years after his loss, bringing a form of closure to a family that had waited 4 decades for definitive word of his fate. Fisher's death during a successful extraction, rather than during an ambush engagement itself, illustrated one of the hidden costs of SAS doctrine. The 30-second ambush minimized casualties during the engagement phase, but the insertion and extraction phases remained dangerous, particularly when helicopters had to operate in contested airspace under enemy observation. By 1970, the Viet Cong had become sufficiently familiar with SAS helicopter insertion techniques that patrols were sometimes engaged within minutes of landing. The Australians responded with a countermeasure called the cowboy insertion, in which a primary helicopter carrying a patrol was followed by a second helicopter carrying a second patrol, with both patrols initially inserting and moving together for approximately 5 minutes before splitting up. The psychological costs of 30-second ambush doctrine extended beyond the war itself into the decades that followed. SAS veterans returning to Australia in the early 1970s brought home patterns of thinking and behavior that had been optimized for jungle survival and that did not translate well to civilian life. The discipline of remaining motionless for 24 hours while maintaining complete situational awareness. The ability to initiate catastrophic violence within 1/10 of a second of visual confirmation of a target. The habit of processing every environmental signal as potentially threat-relevant. These capabilities had been developed through 18 months of selection and training, then refined through year-long combat tours. They could not simply be set aside upon return to Australian civilian society. Australian Vietnam veterans, including SAS veterans, subsequently showed elevated rates of post-traumatic stress disorder that exceeded those of comparable American veteran populations, despite Australian casualty rates during the war being lower than American rates. The discrepancy reflected the nature of Australian service rather than the danger of it. SAS soldiers who had conducted 5 or 6 combat patrols per month for 12 months had accumulated combat stress exposures that, in aggregate, exceeded what most American infantry experienced during equivalent tours. The hypervigilance that had kept them alive in Vietnam did not automatically turn off when the helicopter carried them back to Nui Dat for the final time. For some, it never turned off at all. This was the hidden dimension of the 30-second ambush doctrine. It produced extraordinary tactical effects on the battlefield, but it required soldiers to become something other than what civilian society was equipped to reintegrate. The technical legacy remained, and continues to shape special operations doctrine to the present day. Visit any modern special operations training facility in the English-speaking world, from the Special Forces Qualification Course at Fort Bragg to the Australian SAS Selection Course at Bindoon, and you will find small unit ambush doctrine that traces its intellectual lineage directly back to the jungles of Phuoc Tuy Province in the late 1960s. The 5-man patrol composition, the Claymore-initiated kill, the 30-second engagement window, the immediate break contact and extraction protocol. These are no longer considered exotic Australian innovations. They are considered fundamental small unit doctrine, taught to every special operator in every Allied force. The sawn-down rifles became less common as purpose-built short-barreled weapons like the M4 carbine replaced improvised modifications. The rubber sandals disappeared as counter-tracking philosophy evolved toward different concealment methods. The specific techniques of the Vietnam era have been superseded by newer technologies and refined doctrine. But the underlying conceptual framework, the belief that 5 men with the right training, the right weapons, and the right mindset can dominate a battlefield space larger than their numbers suggest is possible. This framework endures because it has been proven to work. It was proven in Vietnam. It was reproven in Afghanistan, where Australian SAS soldiers conducted operations against Taliban forces using doctrine directly descended from Vietnam-era experience. The American colonel who stood with his stopwatch outside that Nha Trang training area in June 1968 did not understand, in that moment, what he was watching. He thought he was observing a Third World ambush conducted by soldiers who did not understand American doctrine. He was actually observing the future of Western special operations being born in front of him, 30 seconds at a time. The stopwatch recorded the duration of the engagement. It could not record the duration of its influence, which would extend through the remainder of the 20th century and deep into the 21st. The final measure of the doctrine's significance can be found not in American military manuals or Australian regimental histories, but in the operational guidance that communist forces themselves produced during the war. Captured enemy documents from 1970 and 1971, translated and catalogued in the Australian War Memorial's archive collection, contained specific instructions regarding engagement with Australian forces that differed markedly from instructions regarding American forces. Against American units, communist doctrine prescribed aggressive engagement from prepared positions, exploitation of American pattern predictability, and disengagement before American artillery and air support could arrive. Against Australian units, communist doctrine prescribed avoidance whenever possible, extreme caution when avoidance was impossible, and immediate withdrawal upon any indication of SAS presence in an area. The Viet Cong Command did not write those instructions because Australian forces were larger or better equipped or more numerous than American forces. They wrote those instructions because Australian forces had demonstrated through hundreds of 30-second ambushes executed across 5 years of continuous operations that encountering an Australian SAS patrol in the jungle was functionally equivalent to encountering a supernatural force that could not be fought on conventional terms. This was the ultimate validation of what 5 men with Claymore mines and modified rifles had accomplished. They had become something that the enemy feared to the point of refusing contact. They had made themselves into a weapon that could not be countered through superior numbers, superior firepower, or superior preparation. They had become, in the language of the communist documents themselves, Marung, phantoms of the jungle, a force whose presence in an area was itself sufficient to degrade enemy operations. The engagement, when it finally came, lasted 30 seconds. Everything else, the waiting, the stalking, the preparation, the psychological terror they inflicted on enemy forces across entire provinces, these were the long shadows cast by those 30 seconds. The Pentagon classified the full extent of Australian effectiveness for reasons that ranged from diplomatic sensitivity to institutional embarrassment. The communist forces who encountered Australian SAS in the field required no classification to understand what they were facing. They understood it in the way that prey understands predator, instinctively, immediately, and without any need for formal analysis. 30 seconds of violence, delivered by 5 men who had become something more than soldiers and something less than civilians, had taught them a lesson that no amount of Pentagon classification could obscure. The most powerful military force on Earth, the United States Army of the Vietnam era, with its 500,000 troops and its thousands of aircraft and its unmatched industrial base, had learned the same lesson more slowly and more painfully. By the time American doctrine had fully absorbed the implications, the war was over, and the Australians had already gone home. The ambushes they executed remained as a template. The template shaped the doctrine that shaped the training that shaped the operators who fight in small teams in difficult places to this day. All of it began with a 30-second engagement in a Vietnamese jungle, watched by an American colonel with a stopwatch, who stopped watching when the stopwatch stopped. The colonel's name has been forgotten. The doctrine has not.